Welcome everyone to another edition of Kaiju Corner, the penultimate edition of Kaiju Corner. Godzilla King of the Monsters is right around the corner, and I'm getting close to wrapping up these giant monster movie reviews. But today is going to be a really long one, very involved one, for multiple reasons. One, we're going to be dealing with monsters from television series, both in live action and animation, and I really got very particular about what I was going to select for this thing. And as it turns out, most of what I picked is material I had not watched before. So unlike the other editions of Kaiju Corner where I was very familiar with all the monsters like Gamera and Mothra and Rodan, all that other stuff, here I'm going to be taking a look at mostly things I'd never watched before, and I really only got into in preparation for this review series. So I'm looking at this with a fresh perspective, just a new experience for me. And some of these things are famous in the world of animation, specifically in anime. Big titles in from the anime genre, and big live-action tokusatsu type of series as well, as with a few sprinkled in there that I grew up with as well. But there's going to be a lot of new material here, so I'm not as familiar with it. So there's a lot of things to keep track of, from character names and different big events that happened in various episodes. So trying to keep it all together in my head is going to be crazy. So I've got a lot of notes here proposed up on it's all projected here on my computer screen. And so if I have to stop to read and look up something, that's why, because it's just, most of this doesn't come to me as naturally, because most of it's new for me. So I'm basically a new fan of these things. So bear with me. This is the one edition from Kaiju Corner where I'm not coming at it from the perspective of someone who's a lifelong fan. I would never call myself an expert in this field of kaiju fandom, but I'm not the most knowledgeable about these things. So if I get something wrong, or if I take a little while to look up a character name or something, just bear with me. Also, because it's television, I had to kind of approach it a little bit differently from reviewing movies, where I don't want to spoil the shows, and I've tried to avoid movie spoilers, but sometimes that's just kind of unavoidable. And with TV shows, it's like some of these shows, I would say none of the shows that I reviewed as part of this episode were long shows necessarily, but it's still like 39, 40, 26 episodes for some of these shows. And, I don't want to go down and review each episode one by one, because God damn it, I'll be here all night taping this thing. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the series, what it's about, why I like it, because it actually, as it turns out, I liked pretty much everything that I'm reviewing today, so that's good. Basically, overview of the series, the characters, what it's about, why I liked it, and why you should check it out. So it's going to be more of a brief overview of the shows, because I really don't want to give away any spoilers or anything, and I highly recommend you check out these shows for yourself and make your own decisions. And there's a real good chance that you guys have probably watched this material before I have. In the case of the animes in particular, I'm willing to bet money that most of the people that watch this video have seen the animes before. So it's really, I don't feel like I'm giving you any kind of fresh perspective on this. I'm probably not telling you anything that you don't already know, but again, maybe it'll be interesting for you to see me, kind of experience these things for the first time and give my own opinions of them. So with all of that said, let's get the penultimate edition of Kaiju Corner underway. So, the first thing we'll be reviewing and looking at is a little show from 1966. And this is the show, and I guess I'm going to go back to the beginning here. When I decided to do Kaiju Corner, people had requested that I'd reviewed non-Godzilla Kaiju films. And that kind of I kind of went too far with it. And I was like, all right, we got to review this and this and this. And I started snatching things from all over the place and all the things that I grew up with. I got to review that, I got to review this, I got to go through Toho's whole library and review all of that stuff, I got to review all the camera films, and it got to a point where it was almost too much, and I think at one point in my original list, I was going to review all of Ray Harryhausen's films, his special effects driven films, which that would have been crazy, and at another point I was going to review a movie called Q, the Winged Serpent, and I was like, you know what? I could probably drop that one. I'd also talked about doing the, oh god, what was that movie? The Giant Claw, but I feel like James Rolfe has covered that one so extensively, he's kind of made it his own joke that there's really nothing I could add to that one. So I had to whittle the list down. And one thing I decided, though, as I was putting the list together, I decided, it's if I'm going to do a tokusatsu kaiju movie based review series, I have to cover Ultraman. Even though I had never watched Ultraman before. How I'd never watched it, I don't know. But I mean, really, Ultraman was the show that kind of took what Godzilla was doing on the big screen and brought it to television audiences. And from there, it kind of exploded. And Ultraman was the one that got, basically inspired so many other different things like Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, which then got brought to the United States and turned into Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which is still going to this day. That's amazing to me that Power Rangers is still going. Power Rangers got left off the list because it's like I got out of Power Rangers so long ago that really, and it's such a big thing still in America that I'd be like, I wouldn't even know where to start. My brother's actually still more of a Power Rangers expert than I am. He's watched all the shows, but I pretty much got out of it after Mighty Morphin. But anyway, going back to Ultraman, it basically took that whole style of filmmaking that Godzilla was doing and applied it to the small screen, and that's where Eiji Tsuburaya comes into play, because Eiji Tsuburaya was the special effects supervisor for many of the Toho films, most famously associated with Godzilla, but he started his own production company and started the Ultra series, which began not with Ultraman, but with Ultra Q, which I've never seen, but was described to me as basically Twilight Zone, or basically like a Japanese Twilight Zone with some giant monsters in it. And to be perfectly honest, comparing that to Ultraman, I think Ultra Q would be more appealing to me, because I'm like, Twilight Zone with monsters, that sounds awesome. I want to see that. I think that would be more my taste. So maybe sometime later I'll watch Ultra Q, because that sounds very interesting to me. But the second series, or the second show in the Ultra series, was Ultraman, which became a huge pop culture icon, and like I said, inspired so many other different things. And really, I can see why, having gone back and rewatched it. Now, has the show aged well? Is it cheesy as hell? No, it has not aged well, and yes, it is super cheesy, but I'll be damned, while I was watching it, I had a stupid grin on my face the entire time I was watching it, and there was a little twinge of regret in me as well, because I was like, man, why didn't I watch this as a kid? I would have loved this as a kid. I'll be honest, I probably would have liked this more than Power Rangers as a kid, because Ultraman, and how do I want to describe this? Ultraman seemed to take itself a little bit more seriously, and that's one of the things I always appreciated about these Japanese TV shows and a lot of the kaiju movies that were out there at the time. They generally took themselves fairly seriously, even if what was going on was completely ridiculous, and there was this legitimate earnestness to it that was kind of infectious. Obviously, you lose some of that with the dubbing, but it's still they did their best with this and made it as fun as possible and made it and in some cases were very creative. And it's hard not to kind of get swept into how infectiously charming it is. I compare that to Speed Racer, which is another thing from that around that same time period that became somewhat of a big hit here in America, and is somewhat well known. So, but Ultraman, it's kind of it's got that same weird Adam West Batman charm where it's you would never make a show like that today, but goddamn, while I watch it, it's just so entertaining and so much fun. And I'm just so regretful I didn't watch it when I was a kid. So, what is Ultraman about? Basically, in some ways, it's kind of the Japanese version of Superman, where it's this guy that has these big superpowers, he keeps it a secret, and he saves the world from monsters and villains and various other things. But basically what happens is there's this alien that comes to Earth and accidentally kills a person who works for what is called the Science Patrol, which is a fairly generic name, but the Science Patrol is basically this science-based organization that exists all over the world, and they run around, solve problems, and solve mysteries that are going on that are unexplained, and they try to, if giant monsters show up, they try to deal with it and fight with it and do whatever. So, a member of the Science Patrol named Hayata is killed accidentally by this alien, and the alien merges his life force with Hayata to save his life, and in the process gives him these superpowers, and he becomes Ultraman. Or as they say in the American version, using the beta capsule, Hayata becomes Ultraman. And it's basically what happens is a typical Ultraman episode Giant monster will show up and cause a lot of trouble. The Science Patrol will then try to deal with the giant monster. They are unsuccessful, and as a last resort, Hayata breaks out the beta capsule and becomes Ultraman and then fights the monster and wins. Now, why doesn't he just lead with that and begin as Ultraman and just fight the monster right away? Well, it's explained that Ultraman's powers are limited, and he's got this light beacon on his chest called the Color Timer. And so he can only be Ultraman for a limited amount of time, so he uses Ultraman as a last resort. And as they explain in almost every single episode with a voiceover, why they need to explain it every episode, I don't know. Maybe it's because they assumed, like, just in case you were coming in at episode 10 and you were confused, and they were doing that for the kids. And, you know, it's not like there's a huge story arc with this series anyway, so... but anyway, the Color Timer, when his time starts to run out, it starts blinking, and when it stops blinking, then Ultraman's powers fade away forever. So he's got a very limited amount of time as Ultraman, but what this format does do is that it allows you to have a big, suited up, masked superhero fight off a giant monster at the end of every episode. So that's always neat and always appealing to me. And you get these men in rubber suits. Many of the Toho monsters, well, not many, but several were used, and their suits were kind of misshapen and reformatted to be Ultraman monsters. I think Baragon was used like 6 times. Because it's like, the head looked different, but I recognized the body. I'm like, I think that's Baragon. And it's funny, because I'd always heard that Baragon got largely left out of Destroy All Monsters because the suit was being used on Ultraman. And I'm like, yeah, they really worked that suit to the bone, man. Because I pointed it out at least 3 or 4 times. Baragon showed up. Godzilla showed up in one episode where he was like this frilled lizard creature that Ultraman ripped off the thrill and then started bullfighting with it, which was kind of hilarious. But I was like, they took the head off of one Godzilla suit, the body of another one, and put the thrill around it and just called it a different monster. So that's the closest we've ever gotten to an Ultraman Godzilla crossover. But God, I wish that had happened. But in any case, so that's basically a typical Ultraman episode. Towards the end of the show, there's 39 episodes, and towards the end, they start to play with the format a little bit, where there's one episode where a member of the Science Patrol starts to feel inadequate and feels that Ultraman does all the work for them and that they're useless, and then the Science Patrolman has to be kind of the hero at the end. I'm like, all right, that plays with it a little bit more. We get one episode where Ultraman, Hayata specifically, starts to feel bad about killing all these monsters. I'm like, all right, that's an interesting idea, because you're killing, basically, in a lot of cases, innocent animals that are just doing what they do. And he starts to feel bad about it, so they play with that a little bit. There's some alien invasion episodes. They really run the gamut as far as, like, all these different kinds of monsters. There's 4-legged monsters. There's one that's kind of like a griffin. There's, like I said, alien invaders. There's ice monsters. There's one episode where there's 2 monsters, and they plan to get the 2 monsters to fight each other. And so Ultraman kills the one that survived that fight. I'm like, oh, strategy! Good for you! There's one where Ultraman goes to an alien world and fights a monster there. So they do play with the format a little bit, especially towards the end. So just when I was starting to get kind of tired of the standard format of an episode, they started to play around with a little bit towards the end. And the final episode, I have to say, is actually kind of somber and bittersweet. I was like, oh, okay, that's a different approach from what I was expecting. But in any case, like, Ultraman, was a huge success in Japan and is well known here in America as well, and actually kept the Ultra series going. And Ultraman has been rebooted and returned and has come back so many times that I can't even begin to cover all of that material. I just wanted to watch the original series that started everything and give my impressions of it. And overall, I can absolutely see why it was the success that it was. Again, it's cheesy, and again, it's kind of cheap, but there is this infectious charm to it. It actually, the way the episodes are formatted, it kind of reminded me of the old Fleischer Superman cartoons, to bring it back to Superman. So it's kind of like they took, like, the formatting of the Fleischer Superman cartoons from, like, the 40s, and combined it with, like, elements of making a Godzilla movie, and it just made for a really fun and colorful series that I could absolutely see kids being sucked into. And, Ultraman is an icon that persists to this day. Like I said, there's always seems to be some new version of Ultraman out there. And actually, one other version that I wanted to cover when I announced that I was going to be doing this review series, and I mentioned that I was going to be covering Ultraman, I did want to do one of the Ultraman movies, of which there are several, and I asked my viewers for a recommendation. And the one that was most heavily recommended to me was 2004's Ultraman the Next. Very funny that it came out in 2004, the same year that Godzilla had his 50th anniversary film with Godzilla Final Wars. It's like, we're always so close to having that crossover, but it just didn't happen. There's a lot of crazy kaiju crossovers I'd like to see, but honest to God, watching Ultraman the Next, this was about as good an Ultraman reboot as I could possibly imagine. I was really surprised at how good it was. In this one, the Science Patrol doesn't really factor into it. I don't know if it's basing it off of some other continuity with the Ultra series that I'm not aware of. I just kind of looked at the film as like the introduction to a new Ultraman, and it doesn't really factor into the continuity of anything else. And here we see like this big Air Force pilot that comes in contact with the alien force that ultimately transforms him into Ultraman. And there's this underground organization that's studying him and another creature called the One, who's another human being that came in contact with a more malevolent alien force and slowly transforms into this gigantic creature that they've dubbed the One, which is, you know, you look back at some of these monsters that have had these like overly long, complicated names, and here this one's just simply called the One, which seems way more badass than, you know, coming up with something with 20 syllables. But this creature evolves by absorbing other animals. So you see him absorb snakes, and you see him absorb like bats and rats and various other things, and he gains the ability to fly and just grows larger and larger. Whereas the main character of this film becomes more and more comfortable with being Ultraman and having to stop the One. And Ultraman in this movie is actually dubbed the Next by this underground organization, hence the name Ultraman the Next. It's like, oh, you get the One, and then Ultraman is codenamed the Next. And I'm like, oh, that's very simplistic naming conventions there, but I'll let it slide. And I think the build-up to the fights is great. I think the monster that Ultraman has to fight is really creative, and I think the fights themselves are really cool. So I was really surprised at how good it was. I really enjoyed that film, and it's like so colorful, so fun, very good. Like, I could see a movie like that fitting in with like the Marvel Cinematic Universe pretty easily. You know, there's an interesting crossover. Ultraman joins the Avengers. That'd be pretty awesome. But it was a really fun kind of superhero film. And right at the end of, you know, using man in rubber suits for special effects, like right at the tail end of that. Again, this is the same time as Godzilla Final Wars. Now, I wish they had done more to make the movie a little bit more emotionally resonant, as they explain that the pilot has a son who has like a some kind of movie disease that's killing him. They don't really elaborate on what it is. And the person that mutated into the One also has a connection to another character in the film. I felt like they could have made those sections of it a little bit more emotionally resonant and added a little bit more to the drama, but other than that, like, I thought the film was very entertaining and a very good representation of what makes Ultraman, and a great update for Ultraman. So, very entertaining film. So thank you to everybody that recommended it for me, and I'm going to recommend it to you guys that haven't seen it. It's going to get a really solid score for me. See the reviews in the description section to see where I rank it. But so yeah, I mean, that's really all I wanted to cover with Ultraman, which was something that I feel should have been a big part of my childhood, and I just missed out on it. And I don't know how, I don't know why, but I wish I'd seen it, because man, oh man, kid me would have loved it. Loved it. But Ultraman, absolutely, he's a pop culture icon and deserves all the excitement and praise that it gets, because it is a ton of fun. And the original series, I believe you can get on DVD. I don't know if that covers both the dub and the Japanese original tracks, but either way, I mean, even though the dub is a little cheesy, I recommend checking out the dub to the original show. Actually, fun fact, one of the voice actors on the original dub was Earl Hammond, who was most famous for being a voice on Thundercats. Voiced many characters on that show, was a huge favorite show of mine as a child. The character he was most famous for voicing was Mum-Ra, the Ever-Living, the villain of that series. I was like, oh my god, Mum-Ra. I have such fond memories of Mum-Ra. Maybe one day I'll do a video talking about Thundercats, but just wanted to make that connection there. So, That covers Ultraman. Let's jump into a show that I did grow up with as a kid. Speaking of Thundercats and other 80s cartoons, let's go into one that often gets overlooked and is kind of sort of been lost to the sands of time. It wasn't really a big hit when it came out. The Inhumanoids, The Evil That Lies Within, a show that was made by Hasbro and Sunbow. They were the same people that produced shows like G.I. Joe and Transformers, which were massive hits. They also did Gem and the Holograms. They also did the original My Little Pony series and various other shows like that. And actually, Inhumanoids started the same way that Gem did, and I didn't know this until recently, but they were parts of a show called like Super Sunday, where they would air in like 6 or 7 minute segments, and then they would jump to a new show. So it was like Gem and Inhumanoids and 2 other shows that would have 6 to 7 minute segments on this Super Sunday block, and those 6 to 7 segments would be edited together and sold as a direct-to-video movie, which was how I first got exposed to Inhumanoids, because I saw the original movie that was released on VHS. And coming out of the Super Sunday, I don't even know what the other 2 shows were. Gem was obviously the biggest success to come out of that, and Inhumanoids was the second that got its own series. It got a 13-episode season. The first 5 episodes of the series are just the movie edited down into 5 different parts. So you had like 22 6 to 7 minute segments that got spliced together to make a movie that then got edited down again to make 5 episodes of the show. So it's like, man, they really put that one through the ringer. But anyway, Inhumanoids was based off a toy line, as all 80 shows were. And in this toy line, it was about 3 ancient monsters that get released, and a group of scientists have to stop them. So it kind of sounds like Ghostbusters in a way, but there's a little bit of Journey to the Center of the Earth. There's a little bit of like Ray Harryhausen at work here, a little bit of Godzilla, a little bit of Evil Dead. It references so many things, a little bit of Lovecraft. It references so many different things that it just feels like this wonderful amalgamation of like every monster that ever existed. They just threw everything that they knew onto the screen and just had so much fun with it. And I remember the toys, and I'm going to circle back to the toys in a bit. But the Inhumanoid toys themselves were really cool, specifically the monster pieces. And to me, it was just perfect fodder for a TV series. And what we ended up getting was probably 5-year-old me's ideal TV show. If you asked 5-year-old me what I wanted in a TV series, it would have looked like this. So here's the story of Inhumanoids. As I said, you have 3 ancient monstrous demons that get released from the center of the earth. These creatures include Tendril, who's like a vine-like creature, and he's the most Lovecraftian of the bunch. And if you cut off his limbs grow into another tendril creature, so he almost like can't be killed. A little bit of the Gargantuas at work there as well, but Tendril is actually the least interesting of the 3. The leader of the Inhumanoids is Metlar, who's basically the devil. He lives at the Earth's core in his own lair called Infernac. And he's this big fire demon that can throw fire out of his mouth and all this other stuff. And he's like this fierce, like, again, Satan-like creature. And I should point out that the Inhumanoids are pretty large. They're like, I guess King Kong-sized would be appropriate approximation of how big they are. And Metlar's the leader of the group. However, the most interesting of the 3 is by far Decompose, who was voiced by Chris Latta, most famous for voicing Starscream and Cobra Commander in Transformers and G.I. Joe, respectively. And Decompose is a skeletal dinosaur creature, and this is where the Evil Dead aspect comes in, who lives in his own lair of Skellweb, where he has this undead army that he brings into fights with him. He's also... his biggest weakness is sunlight, or what he calls white burn, which makes sense because he's this undead abomination. And he's got like exposed ribcage that he uses to hold prisoners and various other things. But most disturbing of all, his power is that by his mere touch and saying his name Decompose, he can transform the living into undead, mindless, giant zombies, which is awesome, I should point out. And in the original miniseries, the movie, the direct-to-video movie, he transforms the female lead of the group, and I'll get into the heroes in a little bit, but he transforms the female lead into like his undead giant zombie bride or whatever, and it is the most grotesque thing I think I've ever seen in a children's show. And very terrifying, gave me nightmares, but goddamn, I loved it. I loved to be scared as a kid. I loved stuff that was a little uncomfortable because it kind of made me feel like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to be watching. And, you look at Decompose alone, and I'm like, I don't know how this show got marketed towards children. Older audiences, maybe, but as, like, the fact that this was marketed as a children's show with a toy line, I'm like, I am absolutely flabbergasted by that. But I'm glad that it did, because I love the show. And so Decompose was far and away the best. But to fight the Inhumanoids, we got to have heroes. So we start off with the scientist team known as the Earth Corps. And you get the 4 members. There's Herc Armstrong, which is like the greatest name ever. Augur, who's my favorite one of the group because he's the hothead that throws a shoe at the TV constantly and always has temper tantrums. So Augur's great. You get Liquidator, who's like the chemistry expert. And you got Dr. Derek Bright, who's probably the least interesting of the bunch, but kind of a nerd. So you get the 4 scientists, and they team up with these elemental creatures that have been fighting the Inhumanoids for eons. They are called the tree-based redwoods and the stone-based granites. So those are some of the allies, and they actually got toys as well, and they're actually very creepy-looking toys. So it's like, it was one of those shows where it's like, isn't it cool that like the hero toys are actually kind of scary-looking too? That's kind of great. And the most interesting of the Mutors, and that I should point that out, that the Mutors are the Redwoods and the Granites collectively. That's like their alliance. They're called the Mutors. But the most interesting of the Mutors is the creature Magnacore, who probably makes the least amount of sense of any character on the show. But basically, Magnacore is a being that can split into 2 separate beings that have like this magnetic polarity power to him. And the powers generated by the 2 separate beings is able to hold Metlar in check. So the only thing that can paralyze the immortal Metlar is this magnetic field created by this being. So when we're introduced to them, he's actually been holding Metlar in stasis for millennia. So wait a minute. So these 2 beings have to stand there and generate their magnetic powers and hold Metlar in stasis forever. Do they get bathroom breaks? Do they eat? That seems like a very unthankful job, but very thankless position in the universe. But hey, I guess somebody's got to do it. But Magnacore, very interesting character to say the least. It's just very odd concept, and this show was full of odd concepts. But it turns out the villains aren't just the Inhumanoids. There are also some villainous human characters that want to manipulate and use the Inhumanoids for their own goals. Most notably is Blackthorn Shore, whose sister is Sandra Shore, who, as I mentioned, got turned into the undead zombie bride of Decompose. And she actually ends up funding Earth Corps and goes along with them. She gets her own exosuit. And I guess I should have mentioned that. The Earth Corps, they wear their own exosuits as they enter the Earth's core to fight the Inhumanoids. And they have their own gadgets and everything that goes along with that. So Sandra actually helps the Inhumanoids, and her brother is the evil Blackthorn. Yes, that's his first name, Blackthorn. And he has his own Darth Vader-looking exosuit that he uses that actually duplicates Magnacore's power, so he can manipulate and immobilize Metlar as well. And he basically plans to use the Inhumanoids to his own evil, selfish gains. And in future episodes, as we get introduced to more characters, I should also note that this show only ran for 13 episodes. They crammed a lot into 13 episodes, let me tell you. Because I'm still going here. We've still got more to go. He ends up making friends with an evil scientist called Dr. Mangler, who gets killed. Yes, this series actually killed somebody. But thanks to cybernetic enhancements and the powers of Decompose, Dr. Mangler gets reanimated into the character Nightcrawler, who looks like an unholy abomination that would have made a great toy had a toy ever been released. Unfortunately, Nightcrawler didn't get a toy. And I'm sure Marvel probably would have sued. Well, Marvel actually had a hand in creating the show, so that would probably be a problem now, but I guess they could just call him Dr. Mangler if they ever brought it back. It would work just as well. But yeah, he's like this unholy skeletal cyborg abomination. I'm like, that is so cool. So cool. And we also get introduced to new Inhumanoids and new members of Earth Corps throughout the series. We get introduced to the flying guy who would be Saberjet, and we get introduced to Tankmaster, who's the Soviet that joins the crew. So it's like, oh, we've got some cross-political association going on there in the 80s. I like it. And the new Inhumanoids are the monstrous Gargoyle, who's a blue cycloptic creature with a see-through stomach, no arms. He just runs around and eats things. That's all he does. They introduce this monster by hatching in like a nest. He hatches and then proceeds to eat his newborn siblings. This show is amazing. I can't believe it made the air. But anyway, so Gag Oil is just this walking stomach that runs around eating things, and it's disgusting and awesome. And I can't believe that this thing made it to TV. And we also get introduced to the character of Slither, who's the Lord of the Snakes, and was actually Metlar's master back in the ancient days before Metlar was able to imprison him. So, a lot of lore, a lot of characters, a lot of stuff got crammed into 13 episodes. But I think what helped set it apart from shows that Sunbow was making, like Transformers and G.I. Joe, is that it had an evolving storyline with betrayals and events of one episode playing into the next, which was very rare back in the 80s, and gave it kind of a comic booky feel. Another thing that kind of gave it a comic book feel was the heavy use of shadows and split screen effect, where you see different perspectives of the same scene. So it kind of felt like a big motion comic at times, and that really helped to set it apart from all the other shows that were going on in the 80s and gave it its own unique appeal and its own unique style. And as it turns out, part of the reason that they were allowed to get away with, according to an interview I saw with the series head writer Buzz Dixon, one of the reasons they were able to get away with a lot of what they got away with was because the toy line had already been canceled before season 1 had been completed. So they were just kind of allowed to do whatever they want. Hasbro pretty much told them, it's like, look, the toy line's being canceled, do whatever you want, as long as it's not X-rated, just go nuts. And they went nuts, so they had a lot of creative freedom on the show, and it was nightmare fuel in a lot of cases, but good lord was it so much fun, and I would have loved it if Inhumanoids had continued to become one of the big hits of the 80s, but if the toys don't sell, which was ultimately what killed it, your show's not going to last long. And I think the toys didn't sell well because even though the Inhumanoid pieces were the best parts, they were also the most expensive because they were the largest pieces. So like Tendril, Metlar, and Decompose would be like $40 each. And it's like, that's, if you're a kid with not a lot of income back in the 80s, if you're getting any of the Inhumanoids, you're only going to get one of them most likely. And that kind of like kills the potential of the series because the Inhumanoids are the pieces you want and they're the most expensive. It's not like in G.I. Joe where the most expensive piece is the USS Flag. You don't need the flag. I never wanted the flag, to be honest, so I didn't need it. But with Inhumanoids, you kind of want the Inhumanoids, and if you make them the most expensive piece, you're kind of pricing yourself out of existence as far as the toy line goes. But maybe if they had scaled the Inhumanoid pieces down to like 8 inches and kind of scaled all the other figures in accordance with that, it probably would have worked, as is. It's unfortunate, but the toy line was cool anyway. I remember my brother had Metlar. I've seen like baby pictures of him recently. I was going through an old photo family album, and there's a picture of him holding Metlar, which was pretty cool. And I always wanted to Decompose, though. I never got it, because I was a little, this show came out in 86, and I was only a year old, so I didn't get into Inhumanoids until a few years after the fact. So I kind of missed it, but I have gone back and watched every episode. I wish it would get like a full DVD release, because it would be so cool to go back and relive that series. It is wild. It is crazy. A show like this would never be made for kids today. And it's kind of sad, though, because I keep hearing about Inhumanoids, or I keep hearing about all these Hasbro properties that keep coming back, like My Little Pony and Transformers and G.I. Joe. And I want Transformers and G.I. Joe to come back. My Little Pony I don't give a shit about. But G.I. Joe and Transformers I would love, I'm always down for them to come back in various forms. Not a fan of the Michael Bay movies, but, it's any good animated shows that we can get out of it, I'm okay with. But I keep hearing rumblings that like Mask is going to come back and Visionaries is going to come back, but I never hear Inhumanoids come up. And I think there is a wealth of creativity that you can play with for Inhumanoids, for movies, for TV shows, for comics, and for whatever reason it just doesn't come back. So I would love for Inhumanoids to come back, but as is, it's this nice little time capsule gem from my childhood that I have so many fond memories of, and I'm glad that I lived through. And it gave me nightmares, but good lord was it fun. And in the description, I'm gonna include some clips, like the intro and one specific scene with Decompose that really sells why I love that character so much. Because Decompose in particular is basically Godzilla meets Evil Dead, so I just love that character. If we can get a Decompose movie, I don't need anything else. Just give me a Decompose movie and I'll be happy. But that's asking a lot, I guess. But in any case, Inhumanoids is a fond part of my childhood. I put it right up there with He-Man and Thundercats and G.I. Joe and Transformers and DuckTales and Ninja Turtles and all the other shows that I fell in love with back then. It just doesn't get it didn't have the fame and the success, so it doesn't get all the love, which is unfortunate, but maybe one day Inhumanoids will return. But in any case, let's move from Western animation to Eastern animation. Let's go into the world of anime, which is something that I'm not the biggest expert on. I haven't watched a lot of anime. I'm not a huge expert on it. I don't go to cons or anything, and I haven't... I've never seen Akira. And that sounds insane, because I feel like everyone my age has seen Akira, but I haven't seen it. It's just... and that's nothing against, Eastern animation. I just... with all the media I've consumed over the years, it's just something that always kind of fell to the wayside. And most anime I've consumed is stuff that gets brought over to the States and gets Americanized, like DBZ, like Voltron. Those were the ones I grew up with. Things like Evangelion, Neon Genesis Evangelion, kind of escaped my notice until years later. I recently watched the entire series, and I'd always heard about it, and people have been recommending the show to me forever. And actually... to tie it back into my own personal interests, let me make sure I get these names right. Hideaki Anno was known for... let's see, what did he do? He directed Neon Genesis Evangelion and the End of Evangelion, and had a heavy part in creating it as well. So he also helped create... he was one of the directors for Shin Godzilla. He was partnered up with Shinji Higuchi, who also directed the live-action adaptation of Attack on Titan. More on that in a bit. But, it's funny how these guys, they're actually part of the two big animes that I'm reviewing as part of this. And they had a hand in helping to make one of my more favorite Godzilla movies. So it's funny how everything just kind of circles back to Godzilla. But anyway... So I watched Neon Genesis Evangelion finally. My first exposure to it actually came... it was a preview on a VHS tape I had for both Gamera Guardian of the Universe and Destroy All Monsters. They both got released by ADV Films. ADV Video, I think it's called. And Neon Genesis Evangelion had a trailer in front of both Destroy All Monsters and Gamera Guardian of the Universe. I believe it was both anyway, but... that was my first exposure to it. I know, it's giant robots fighting monsters. That's awesome. Maybe I'll watch that one day. Never did until recently. But as it turns out, Neon Genesis Evangelion is not exactly giant monsters versus giant robots. There's a lot more to it. It is fucking crazy. You know what? I'd heard that the creator of this show was suffering through depression at the time that it was being released. I was kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it kind of shows, because there's a lot of philosophy going on. There's a lot of interior struggle from the main characters going on. It just feels like it was written by somebody who was working some shit out, to say the least. So this is a very heavy show to watch from start to finish. It isn't just a glorious Pacific Rim style giant robots beat up giant monsters. There's a lot more to it, and especially as you start answering questions throughout the series, it seems to raise even more questions, and everything just kind of builds and builds and gets crazier and crazier and crazier. So what is Neon Genesis Evangelion about? Basically, you have these giant monsters that show up and cause apocalyptic events. They're called angels. And to combat them, there are these bizarre creations that we're not really sure what they are, called the Evas, the Evangelions. And they are piloted by children, by essentially children, who have their own issues of inadequacy and various other things going on, social anxiety disorders and everything else. And they are thrust into battle, forced in by adults. They're forced into battle against these giant monsters, and you see all these different conflicts, both interior and exterior, throughout the entire series. The characters involve, the main character is Shinji, who's the main Jaeger, I almost said Jaeger, the main Eva pilot, and he's a messed up little shit, because he's got a father who is the worst father ever, who's also in charge of the organization that runs the Evas. He's got so many fucking problems. I feel so bad for that poor kid. Eventually we get introduced to Asuka, who's the more quiet and reserved Eva pilot, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding her and what goes on in her backstory. I don't even want to cover, because you can't cover that without spoiling anything. You've also got Rey, who starts off as an obnoxious little shit, but then you realize, it's like, oh god, she's fucked up too. Everybody on this show is fucked up. Probably my favorite character in this series is actually Masato, and that's not because she's the hot chick, because I don't get attracted to animated characters, because they're not real. I never understood that. I guess whatever floats your boat, do your thing, but I never understood, like, some people getting attracted to animated characters, because to me it's like, they're not real. Like, I don't get it. Maybe that's why they're attractive, because it's like the ultimate fantasy. Who knows? But I don't like her because she's the hottest girl around or whatever, but I like her because she's like, she's got her own shit that she's dealing with, and she's trying to be like the Rock that's holding all this shit together, because Shinji ends up living with her because his dad's a piece of shit, and she has to be like the guiding force that keeps the Eva program on track and keeps Shinji on track and has to watch over the other kids and everything. So she has to be the big parent while everybody else is kind of having their own meltdowns and everything. So I kind of liked her a lot. She was also very funny and charming, so I thought she was by far my favorite character in the set. And she never fights a giant monster, and she never pilots an Eva, but she was probably the most interesting character of the bunch. So, I guess my favorite character would be Pen Pen, because he's a little penguin that walks around. Who doesn't love a little penguin that walks around? But anyway, Basato's a strong number 2. I'm just kidding, of course. But anyway, what we get throughout the series that about like all the mysteries and all the inner turmoil that everybody's dealing with, you do get a lot of great action sequences that are fan-fucking-tastic. Very well animated, very dynamic action sequences. Each one is different, and some of them are downright brutal. Actually, it's funny, because my sister's been recommending the show to me for years. And when I finally watched it, I told her, it's like, man, episodes 18 and 19 are fucking great. Her first response was, I fucking knew you would like those episodes. I knew when I watched Ava the first time, I was like, I think episodes 18 and 19 are going to be Patrick's favorites. And she was absolutely correct, because it was the perfect blend of like action, story, and character all like coming together and making for some great storytelling and character development, and having just some really cool, badass, somewhat brutal action sequences. And everything builds really well, and everything's going really well until you get to the last 2 episodes. And this is like an infamous part of the series where apparently the budget had been cut or something, and they weren't able to do everything that they wanted to do for the finale. So what they ended up doing was like this introspective, like character realization for Shinji, and that's like a 2-part finale that is wildly unfulfilling and a really weak sauce ending to the series. So thankfully, I'm willing to forgive it, because we got a movie to wrap everything up more appropriately, and that would be the End of Evangelion, the big movie to answer all the questions, kinda, and to end the series, kinda. And what we got here was a beautifully animated film, a wild, philosophical, crazy, insane display with religious symbolism, philosophy, and everything else you could possibly imagine. And one of the trippiest fucking films I've ever seen in my entire life. I really enjoyed it. I think the movie's great. It's a total mindfuck. But it's a way more satisfying ending to the series than the last 2 episodes of the series itself. So there is that. I really don't want to go into detail about the movie, because there's nothing I can say about it that isn't a spoiler. There is a great action sequence with one of the Avas fighting off a bunch of like different angels. That's really nice. And that's pretty much all I want to say. There's some great animation and action in it, but really, like, no words I can say can really do the movie justice, and there's nothing I can say without spoiling anything. So I'm just going to say that the movie's great. I highly recommend it. Keep in mind, it is an absolute mindfuck. I've actually heard people criticize both the series and the movie for being, quote, pretentious. I don't think it's pretentious. I think it's a creative mind that is really trying to work a bunch of shit out. And had his own, like, personal issues, and I was going through depression at the time, and it definitely shows. And it's like, he is going through some shit. And he's working it all out in this series that really went above and beyond anything I would have ever expected. Again, I was just kind of expecting like, oh, it's this cool little robots versus giant monster show, and it's so much more than that. If that doesn't appeal to you, if you want something a little bit simpler, like something more akin to Pacific Rim, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love Pacific Rim, the original movie, the first movie anyway. But if you're looking for something like that's just again, mindfuck is the only word I can use to describe it. If you're looking for something like that, this is for you. And again, there's a real good chance you've probably seen this before me, but in any case, I think Evangelion is great. I'm really glad that I finally got to watch it, and yeah, I highly recommend it. Next up is another anime I wanted to cover, Attack on Titan, and this is another one that came highly recommended to me because I love giant monsters and I love cool shit, so people were like, Patrick, I think you would like this one. And I've watched season 1. I have not watched anything else other than that, so this review is going to be centered mostly on season 1 and all the material I've watched. And to be perfectly honest, I loved the show. I thought it was really good. And really what I loved about it was the world. I think the world that was on display here is really, really cool and got me hooked almost instantly. Where basically what you have here is a world where humankind is being overrun by these giant creatures called Titans, which again is another tie to Godzilla. I guess everything ties back to Godzilla. Godzilla's like the fucking Kevin Bacon of monsters. I could tie almost anything monster related back to Godzilla in some way. But anyway, the Titans, the giant monsters in question in this series, are both hilarious and terrifying at the same time. I've never seen quite a dichotomy like that, but basically they're giant naked people with no genitalia, and a lot of them have like silly expressions on their faces. One of them smiles. They'll have like these frozen weird expressions. They don't talk. But there's something like unsettling about watching a giant smiling naked person eat somebody. And it's pretty gruesome how it's displayed. So, in any case, so to avoid the Titans, humankind kind of hides in these societies or in these giant cities behind giant walls. And they have names for each of the walls. I don't remember them offhand, but and so it's this giant walled society. Kind of reminded me of Minas Tirith from Lord of the Rings in that regard. And in the series, the Titans finally break into the city through the walls, and now everything is kind of centered around trying to stop them, fight them back, and defend the other walls within the city. So, to combat the Titans, we have the Scout Regiment, who's this group of fighters that work with this very interesting technology that based on, like, I guess in America we would call them, like, Batman grappling hook technology, basically. And, you know, they have, like, swords and all this other stuff, and they're always, like, shooting off the walls, and everything is designed to attack the Titans in the back of their neck, which is their big weakness. So, again, I think I've got that right. And I love that whole aspect to it, because it's like, one of the cool things about dealing with giant monster movies is, like, all right, how are they going to fight the thing? And typically, a lot of the creativity comes of, like, how they decide to try and fight the thing. That's how you end up with things like the Oxygen Destroyer and things like that. So them having to devise like this whole group that's specially trained to fight them using this specialized technology, I think was really, really neat and very, very cool. And I should also note, this is not a modernized setting. This feels like something that would have been set in like the 1500s or something, but with like this really cool like suspension-based technology to fight the Titans. But I guess technology advances based on need, and when you need to combat these things, you wind up with these special gadgets and everything. So that's all cool. The main character of the series is Eren Yeager, which I wonder if Pacific Rim naming the robots after the Yeagers has anything to do with that. But anyway, again, a lot of connections here. And he is compelled to join the Scout Regiment. He wants to join them anyway, but he feels doubly compelled when his mother is killed in a Titan attack. And, you know, his adoptive sister is one of the main characters as well. And he makes friends along the way. There's other characters within the Scout Regiment. And we see all these different battles and struggles against the Titans. And, you know, it's just a really well put together show. And there's still a lot of mystery. Again, I'm only through season 1. There's still a lot of mystery surrounding what the Titans are, what Eren is, and there's a huge reveal with Eren that I don't want to get into. I don't want to spoil it, but we haven't gotten a lot of questions answered regarding that. Again, I'm only through season 1, but that was really interesting to say the least. And it's a very engaging show and very exciting. And when shit gets real, it gets really good. The action is very tense. When the Titans kill people, it's brutal. Again, some of them are hilarious. The way they run is kind of funny. But there's also like something very unsettling about these frozen people. And it's even explained that they don't eat them for digestion. They don't eat them for sustenance because they don't need to, because they can't digest them. So they just like to chew on them just because. And then they spit them out or whatever. I forget how they address that. But it's like, that is really fucked up and weird. But yeah, it is a really weird show, but also a very creative one with a world that I really want to spend more time in. I've not read any of the manga. I've not seen the live action movies. Like I said, the director of the live action movie also co-directed Shin Godzilla, and I love that. But I've heard mixed things about the Attack on Titan movie. I don't know if that's coming from the point of view of purists who just hold the anime up and don't feel that the movie itself is fully representative of the anime. I don't know, but I've heard good things about it as well. So maybe one day I'll check out the movie. But I definitely want to get through the rest of the anime first. But based on everything I saw in season 1, which was about, what was it? I think 25 episodes, I believe. Well, let's see. 26 episodes. Okay. In the, oh no, I'm looking at the Evangelion episode guide. Whoops. All right. Yeah, 25 episodes. And there's, it's a very exciting show, and it actually went by really quick. I actually liked a lot of the breaks it took, where it's like, all right, we got to show how they trained to join the Scout Regiment. And I love all of that stuff. That stuff was really cool. I like Eren and his, like, Captain Ahab-like obsession with wanting to kill the Titans. And I wonder if that's going to play out in later seasons. But really liked his drive as a character throughout the series. And there's a few mysteries. Again, we don't know exactly where the Titans come from yet. There's a female Titan that comes out that is a bit of like the, I guess you would call it like the Racer X or the Green Ranger or something like that. Like this huge X factor that just gets thrown off into the story and you don't know exactly who or what it is. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding that. But again, I don't want to give any spoilers, but I thought the show was very exciting, a lot of fun to watch. I went through it pretty quick. It was one of those shows where I was just like, I gotta watch more. And having watched through season 1, I definitely want to spend a lot more time in this world. So, based entirely on season 1, I give Attack on Titan a huge recommendation on my part. And hopefully the show doesn't jump the shark by the time I start watching seasons 2 and 3. But it's really, really friggin' good so far, and I'm really digging it. So, Attack on Titan is another one of those animes that's like, again, I'm not a huge anime watcher, but it's one of the ones that really won me over. It gets my stamp of approval. So that is really good. So Attack on Titan, huge thumbs up from me. Now we're going to go back. I think I've covered pretty much everything except for the king himself, Godzilla. What has Godzilla done in the world of television? Because he isn't just a movie star. The dude's been in live action TV shows. He's been in commercials like crazy, obviously. If you've ever seen the Dr. Pepper ads or the Charles Barkley ad or the parenting ad that he did where they intercut clips of Son of Godzilla, the Snickers commercial when the 2014 one came out, I think that one's my favorite. But, he's been in animation, he's been in live action shows, and there's a lot of Godzilla material out there, some of which a lot of people probably don't know about. And actually, most of the shows I'm going to talk about, the first 3 I'm going to talk about, are shows that I have not watched in their entirety because they have not been released in America. So I'm just going to give like a super brief overview of these shows and talk about them, what I know about them just from watching clips, and just kind of give my impressions of them just from what I've seen so far. So first of all, what I'm going to cover is Godzilland. If you don't know what Godzilland is, it started as like a merchandise campaign in the 80s. Where they made Godzilla like super cute and super deformed, and they made all the monsters that way. It was geared more towards kids. And Godzilland started as like a trivia-based show with animated segments and some live-action man-in-suit segments made largely for comedy. And these shows were made to hype up Godzilla vs. Mothra in 1992 and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1993. So they're kind of like companion promotional material for those movies. But really what I want to talk about are the 4 OVAs that came out in the mid-90s, featuring the cutesy Godzilla-based characters. I think you would call them like super deformed or chibi or whatever, but these OVAs were more educational and geared towards really young kids, like preschool. So think like, I guess the American equivalent of that would be something like Sesame Street, or I think Mickey Mouse has a show out now called Mickey Mouse Works or something like that. It's very similar to that, where it's just basically teaching basic things to kids. Blue's Clues would be one of those, Dora the Explorer, shows like that. To get a Godzilla version of that is really weird. But basically, it's these 4 OVA specials. One's about addition and subtraction. One's about like how to write your name and various things like that. So you get the monsters running around acting all cute and teaching kids things. So it's basically what it is. It has a super catchy theme song, which I'll be sure to post a link to that video in the description. And the Godzilla monsters themselves are ridiculously adorable. Like, Godzilla's really cute. And Mechagodzilla has rocket feet. It is super cute. And Anguirus is super cute. And Rodan looks super cute. And Ghidorah looks like a 3-headed big bird. It looks ridiculous. And the animation is obviously very limited. But again, it's geared more towards preschoolers. So it's made like super limited and cutesy on purpose. And the idea of it is so hilarious to me. But if that show had been around when I was 3 or 4 years old in America, I would have watched the fuck out of it. I would have watched those like, yes, Godzilla, teach me how to add and subtract, please. There's music videos thrown in. I've seen some of those. I think you can find subtitled versions of them on YouTube. I haven't watched all of them, but I have watched a lot of clips, and it's just so mesmerizing that this even exists. I think the most telling aspect of the entire thing is the inclusion of a pink Godzilla character whose dorsal fins are shaped like hearts. I believe she has a bow, if I'm not mistaken, like a little bow on her head, and she's like Godzilla's girlfriend, and like the American translation of her name is Godzilla. She looks like the product of a dinosaur mating with a Care Bear and is absolutely ridiculous. If they ever worked Godzilla into the live-action films, I would lose my goddamn mind. But for something like this, it's fine. And it's like, it's so silly. It's just so ridiculous. But again, it's meant for really, really little kids. So, if you're looking for, I guess I'm not even really reviewing it because I haven't watched all of it. But if you're looking for a laugh, check out some of the clips on YouTube. They're hilarious. Another show centered around Godzilla was actually another one that was fairly cheaply made and ran from 1997 to 1998. 256 3-minute episodes. So the episodes are really short, but there's 256 of them. But they've never been released in America. Some of them you can find on YouTube, I think on Toho's official channel. But they're not subtitled, so I have no idea what's going on. So, I have not watched these, so I can only give you my impressions of it just from seeing what I've seen. The show's called Godzilla Island, and like I said, they're 3-minute segments, 256 of them. That's a lot, even for 3-minute segments. And it's in the future where the monsters of the world are confined to Godzilla Island, and they're being observed by, I guess, a G-Force equivalent group, and various crazy things happen along the way. Now, the monsters themselves, it's a live-action show, but it's not man-in-suit animation. It's not man-in-suit, tokusatsu, special effects-driven type of stuff. They literally take the Godzilla Bandai toys, and they animate the stories using the Godzilla Bandai toys, and I'm like, okay, number one, it's a cheap promotion for the toys, obviously, but it's like, wow, that is so cheaply made. Now, if they decided to release the entire series on DVD in America, would I buy it? I would. Because I kind of want to watch the whole thing. Because I've read about some of the things that they did do. They included new monsters, actually. Most notable of which was Hyper Mecha King Ghidorah, which is a fully mechanized Mecha King Ghidorah. So no organic parts, not a cyborg, fully robotic King Ghidorah. So all 3 heads are like the metal head of the original Mecha King Ghidorah. And there's a few upgrades to like Hedorah and Mecha Godzilla and a few other things. And there's story arcs with alien invasions and a bunch of other craziness that you would expect out of a Godzilla series. So it sounds interesting, even though it looks cheap as fuck, the fact that they used fucking action figures to animate the monster sequences. But it's, I'm curious, to say the least. And, again, I don't know much about it beyond that. I can just only comment on what I've seen. But again, has a very catchy theme song. They actually took the Akira Ifukube Godzilla theme and they jazzed it up and added lyrics to it. And it's like, wow, this belongs in a fucking like dance club or something. This is amazing. It's way catchier than it should be. Again, I'll post a link in the description. But really good stuff. The song is really good stuff anyway. But again, I can't comment on the show beyond that. Just what I've heard and what I've read, because obviously I haven't watched that much of it. Would I watch it? Yes, because I'm weird. But moving right along, the final Godzilla-based series was actually a live-action series that Toho produced in the 70s. And this show was quite clearly a response to Ultraman and Kamen Rider and various other things. Part of that, like, Japanese superhero-style TV show. Zone Fighter, which is another show I have not seen and has never gotten an official American release. But it's about a family of aliens that come to Earth and defend the Earth as Ultraman-style superheroes. And one of their allies against the great aliens that they fight against is Godzilla himself. Because again, Toho produced this show and Godzilla was in full-on hero mode at this point. So, Zone Fighter family, they pair up with Godzilla. And I've seen clips of it. I've seen clips of Godzilla's inclusion in the series. Also included in the series, among the other giant monsters that the heroes fight on episode-to-episode basis, there's also additional appearances from Gigan and King Ghidorah. Do I want to see more of Gigan and King Ghidorah? Absolutely I do, especially Gigan, who I always felt was one of the coolest Godzilla monsters that got shortchanged in several different ways. So to see additional Gigan material, I think would be very cool. And again, you can find clips of it on YouTube, but the series itself has never been officially released in America in any fashion. So here's hoping one day we get Zone Fighter, because that's like kind of the one that I want. Godzilla Land is a cute thing. I don't need to see it. Godzilla Island, I would watch it just for morbid curiosity's sake, but I don't need to see it. Zone Fighter's the one thing I want to watch, because it's live action, man in suit, Godzilla material that has never been made available in America. And I get additional Ghidorah and Gigan footage thrown in. Now, Godzilla's not in every episode. I should make that point perfectly clear, but I would totally watch the series just to get to those Godzilla episodes, because it's like, I just love the king that much. Again, can't really review the show because I haven't seen it, but on the surface it feels like an Ultraman ripoff, but it's additional Godzilla material, so I want to see it. And that's really all there is to say about the show. That's all I know about it. When I found out that this existed, when I got on the internet, I was like, why hasn't this been released? Where would the interest be? I don't know. I know Shout Factory has released a lot of the Super Sentai, and I think most, if not all, of the Power Rangers shows. So they're releasing both the Japanese and American versions, and it would be like, do Zone Fighter. I think they also released some of the Japanese Transformers series, which I've never watched. I've had Headmasters highly recommended to me, but haven't gotten around to watching that yet. But anyway, that's really all there is to say about Zone Fighter. I can't review what I haven't seen, but again, I'll post clips in the description, links to clips in the description, I should say. And I hope one day I get to see this full series in its entirety with subtitles so I can understand what's going on. But because, again, it's more Godzilla material. I'm on board for that, so yay. But now let's get into the Godzilla shows I actually have watched. And these are 2 animated series that I think most American audiences are fairly familiar with. These are shows that are fairly well known. One of them showed up on Cartoon Network. One of them was on Fox Kids. The first one being the Hanna-Barbera produced Godzilla series, which I actually have the first 8 episodes of on DVD. Why we never got like a full-fledged DVD release, I don't know. But I think you can get at least all of season 1 on Amazon Prime. 26 episodes in all, 2 seasons. produced by Hanna-Barbera, and this is something that's often looked down on and seen as a black eye of the Godzilla franchise by many purists, mainly because it really doesn't adhere to a lot of traditions. The traditional Godzilla roar is not in place. The voice of Godzilla is provided by Ted Cassidy, who played Lurch in the Addams Family, and he does a bunch of grunts and growls and everything else, so it feels weird not to have the classic Godzilla roar. Although that is a neat little nugget that Lurch fucking voiced Godzilla. The show kind of fell into that Hanna-Barbera habit of like having Scooby-Doo tropes. The gang of main characters itself, which I guess I'll bring them up now. You get a boat full of like scientists and various other people that are floating around the sea, and they come across giant monsters, and the captain has a button that summons Godzilla. Why this captain has control over Godzilla, I have no idea. Why you would give any human being that much control, but basically Godzilla saves the day and fights against the monsters. And the characters include Captain Majors, who has the Godzilla button, Dr. Quinn, her nephew Pete, who's the annoying kid, who's actually less annoying when compared to another character that I'm going to bring up, and the science assistant Brock. And the biggest black eye in the show, and you can tell this from watching the intro. The intro's super awesome, where they introduce Godzilla and it's grand and glorious, and then they introduce this fucker right here, Godzuki. And again, this is the Scooby-Doo aspect, where it felt like everything that Hanna-Barbera produced back in this time had to have like a cute animal sidekick, or like one that talks and takes part in the action and everything. So you get this little flying fat fuck who is like Godzilla's nephew, I think it's explained. It's actually never explained how this crew first met Godzilla, where Godzuki came from, what's his relationship to Godzilla. None of that is ever made clear. But I think the series Bible has been leaked, and it's been revealed that like the crew saved Godzuki, and as gratitude, Godzilla would protect them from now on. And it's like, would have been nice to see that origin episode, but hey, would have made sense, you know. But in any case, that's basically the show. You get more superhero Godzilla, and really the main appeal for me as a kid was seeing, all right, what wacky thing is Godzilla going to fight? Because they never use any of the other Toho monsters in there, although there's one that's very close to Rodan, there's one that's very close to Baragon. There's some references for sure. There's a giant turtle that he fights that has magnetic powers. Actually, one of the most memorable episodes, because the magnetic powers cause the turtle to grow. The more magnetic energy he absorbs, he grows. He actually gets big enough to put Godzilla in his mouth, and so that's actually one of the most memorable episodes. But you could probably draw comparisons to Gamera there, but they never definitively use any of the classic monsters in the series, which is fine with me. There's there's like a golden monster creature. There's like a chimera creature. There's the Stone Guardians. All these different things. And for me, it was just appealing to see Godzilla fight a bunch of different things. And I saw this show at the absolute right time, because again, I saw it in Cartoon Network back when that was in its infancy. And as a young kid, as a young Godzilla fan in the US, it sucked, because you had to kind of take whatever you were given. The Japanese versions of these films were not made available to us, so you had to put up with the dub, whether it was good or bad. Not all the films were easy to find on video. Destroy All Monsters I didn't see until I was in my early teens. Some of these movies were really hard to track down. You had to scour through the TV guide to find these movies. I remember staying up till 3 in the morning to watch Frankenstein versus Baragon, just so I could see Baragon in a movie, because that's just what you had to deal with. Merchandising wasn't ideal at the time. A lot of the Godzilla video games were poor, to say the least. It wasn't that good to be a Godzilla fan, to say nothing for the fact that they were still making these movies in Japan and we didn't even know it. Unless you were really, really in the know, didn't have internet access back then. I didn't know they were still making Godzilla movies. So when I got on the internet, when I got on America Online way back in the day, and I found out they were 5 Godzilla movies I'd never seen before, I'm like, fuck you. Like, why are they not available to me? So for me at that time, this show represented additional Godzilla material that it could kind of, satiate my appetite, shall we say, for more Godzilla. And to that end, it was good. I was at the right age to see it, and for me, it was just cool to get more Godzilla material. Is the show that great? I mean, it's not better, than maybe some of the Hanna-Barbera classics, but it's better than a lot of the other shows that they produced. Hanna-Barbera produced a lot of shit. They were like the bad cartoon factory for a while. They just produced like low-rent shit, and they would just throw whatever up against the screen and see what would stick. I would say Godzilla, Godzuki included, even with Godzuki in it. Godzilla the series is not one of Hanna-Barbera's worst projects. It's actually one of their more interesting, that they got like another property and made a show about it, like, which was not necessarily common at the time. I'm sure, I've heard that Harry G. Saperstein, who was responsible for bringing some of the Godzilla films to America and getting them dubbed and whatever, he was responsible for getting the series made as well. But the show, for me, it was what it was. Every episode's kind of the same. There are some that really stand out more than others. There's the one where Godzilla gets caught in this pink fog that they never explain, that causes him to shrink. So Godzilla actually fights like flies and rats, and even goes to like shrinks to like a cellular level at some point. I'm like, that's hilarious. That's great. I love that. But yeah, it was just a fun, silly show that's not really that great as an adult, but as a kid, for me at the time, I have a lot of fond memories of watching it, so I have kind of a soft spot for it, even though I wanted to murder Godzuki with a 2x4. It's, it is what it is. I don't consider it a black eye on Godzilla's history. I think it's a very interesting piece of his history. It's kind of amazing that thing got made. Godzuki can go eat a dick, but the show itself, I don't mind that it exists. It's something that I enjoyed in my youth, and something that I have fond memories of. So, how bad could it have been, really? There are things to nitpick about it. Again, Godzuki. The episodes are repetitive. Godzilla himself changes size. Like, the size of Godzilla seems inconsistent from scene to scene. It kind of reminds me of that Simpson joke where they did the Paul Bunyan episode, which also included Rodan. And Lisa starts pointing out holes in the story. It's like, Paul Bunyan never fought Rodan. Also, his size is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes he's like 20 feet tall, and other times his foot's as big as a lake. Hey, who's the hobo here? But anyway, I just wanted to reference that. But anyway, the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla series, I think it's a very interesting part of Godzilla's history. Much like the Marvel Comics Godzilla series, which also gets looked down on by fans, and I kind of look back on it, it's like, it's this neat little thing they did. I don't have any hatred towards it. And that's kind of how I look at the Hanna-Barbera series. It's a neat little thing that they did. And at a time where I was starved for Godzilla material, it was perfect for me at that time in my life. So I have no malice towards it, except for Godzuki. Fuck Godzuki. But anyway, seriously, and he's always the worst part of the episode. Any episode that you watch, he just interrupts the fucking thing and is just doing his little cartoon stupid antics. I'm like, I hate you so much. But other than that, the show's fine. I'm completely fine with it. But the other Godzilla series, speaking of a black eye on Godzilla's history, the famed TriStar film, the infamous TriStar film that everybody hates. Every Godzilla fan hates it. They call it Gino, Godzilla in name only. Some people call it Godzilla because they took the god out of Godzilla. I myself have said many negative things about this movie, but one thing I will cut it slack for is that it did lead to a lot of good things. The aforementioned 90s Godzilla films that I didn't even know about until I got on the internet. I believe those movies got released because of the TriStar Godzilla film. To hype up that film, those films finally saw a stateside release. So I can't be mad at that. Another good thing that came out of this was the creation of Godzilla the series, which aired on Fox Kids and ties into the TriStar Godzilla film. And to be perfectly honest, the show was pretty good. It still works within the framework of the TriStar film. So there's some things about it that I don't like, but I felt like this was made by Godzilla fans. For one thing, they gave him his atomic breath back, and they made it green here. So it's like Godzilla's atomic breath has gone through all the lightsaber colors. Shin Godzilla was purple. Originally, it was white in the black and white films. Then it turned blue, and then it's like I said, it's been purple. So it's I call the Shin Godzilla breath the Mace Windu breath. It's been red and orange thanks to the spiral beam, so he's got the Sith breath. It's he's gone through just about all the lightsaber colors, I think, with his atomic breath. But anyway, in this show, dovetails right off the end of the movie where there was one Godzilla egg that survived the bombing of Madison Square Garden, and that last Godzilla actually becomes attached to Nick Totopoulos, who was Matthew Broderick's character from the '98 film. And the show centers around Nick Totopoulos forming his own team of scientists, some of which are characters from the film. Dr. Craven and Elsie were in the TriStar film. Some of them are new characters created for the show. There was Randy, who was kind of like the young intern character, and Monique, who was an associate of Jean Reno's character from the '98 film. There's also the robot character Nigel, who they use to get through certain situations and everything, but also gets blown up in every episode. So he feels like the comparison has been made because this came out around the same time that South Park was getting really popular, and he's been compared to Kenny from South Park because he dies in every episode. But because it's a robot, it's okay. It's not too dark for the kids. It's okay to kill him every episode if it's a robot. And it was actually pretty funny how they did some of that. But basically, because Godzilla develops like a maternal, or he sees Nick as like his mother. He follows Nick around and actually becomes like a heroic monster fighting against all the other mutations that pop up all over the place. And again, no classic Godzilla monsters are used, but we do get a lot of really cool creations here. There's a giant bee, there's a giant cobra, there's Crustaceous Rex, who's kind of a Biollante-like creature, but has more like underwater type attributes to it as well. There's a giant bat, there's this metamorphic creature that can transform itself, a chameleon creature, various other things that pop up throughout the course of the show. And they did some really interesting things with it. Some episodes that really stand out to me, the Monster War 3-parter, which is basically just a big reference to Destroy All Monsters. It's really the highlight of the series, where aliens come over and take over the military and some of the scientists and the monsters as well, including Godzilla. And their ace in the hole is actually a cyborg version of the Godzilla that died in the '98 TriStar film. Fans, I think, have called it Cyberzilla. I like to look at it as this show's version of Mechagodzilla in a way. And now Godzilla has to fight a robot cyborg version of his daddy, which is pretty cool. And they give that Cyberzilla the blue atomic breath as a reference to the classic Godzilla. And I'm like, the people that made this are fans. It's clear. It's clear as day that people made this are fans. But, so that was really cool. They did one episode where there was like this, animal rights terrorist group that wanted to protect the monster rights and wanted to free them from Monster Island. That's another thing. They actually introduced a Monster Island concept into the series, which was great. They do another episode that was like a forward flung into the future where the scientists get pushed forward into a post-apocalyptic world where these dragma creatures have killed Godzilla and destroyed most of humanity and the world along with it. And then they have to go back into the past and fix it. There's a lot of really memorable episodes and a lot of creative ideas. And I would say dare I say, the one based on the TriStar Godzilla is actually the definitive Godzilla animated series. Because it's sure as hell not Godzilla, and it's sure as hell not the one with the toys. And, the Hanna-Barbera series, not really. Oh, another aspect about the Hanna-Barbera series, going into the whole, like, non-traditional aspect. I forgot to mention that Godzilla has laser eye beams, which is hilarious to me. That's a different power, but considering now in Shin Godzilla he's shooting lasers out of his tail, I don't think it's that crazy. But in any case, going back to this show, I think that this might be the definitive Godzilla show, and I really was digging it at the time. Unfortunately, this show was kind of a victim of the Pokemon purge, as I like to call it. One of the reasons that I was never a huge fan of Pokemon is that, and it wasn't so much the games, it wasn't so much anything else, it was more the series, because once that show became popular, everything else had to die. And it felt like all of my favorite shows just got obliterated because Pokemon became popular, and then all the knockoffs started. That's when Digimon showed up. And it was actually Digimon that kind of took over the Fox Kids block, and Godzilla kind of went to the wayside. But in this great mass exodus, like, Pokemon showed up, and everybody tried to emulate Pokemon. So Batman had to end, Superman had to end, Animaniacs had to end, Pinky and the Brain had to be ruined and then ended, and Godzilla got canceled. So it was like all my favorite shows. I think Freakazoid was one of those that got purged. It was dark. It was a dark time. And so I've always been bitter against Pokemon ever since, and anything else that spawned from it. So Digimon I hate as well. Not as bitter about it now. I've kind of gotten over it since then, but it was just sad that I just woke up one morning and all my favorite shows were killed. It was like, shit. And unfortunately, Godzilla was one of those where it was there was just no room. Sorry about that. My computer's making noises. There was just it was just purged. There was no room for it in the new world, and everything else had to go away. So. Unfortunately, the series didn't last as long as it probably should have, but we did get a great number of episodes. Again, some of them very memorable. I actually didn't mention this one. This is probably the most famous episode. The one where Godzilla gets a mate, Komodo Thrax. He actually bonds with a Komodo dragon. And it's actually kind of a tragic episode as well. It's kind of sad, but it's like Godzilla gets a girlfriend. That's a daring direction to take, but... interesting that they tackled that for sure, but in any case, I thought Godzilla the series was really, really good and one that I hold in pretty high esteem, and dare I say, the definitive animated Godzilla. I don't know. Because even with the anime trilogy that just got released, I would be like, I don't know. I think Godzilla the series might be the best one. Which is crazy to say, but I think what separates this show from the movie it spawned from, it's clear to me that Roland Emmerich did not give a shit about Godzilla. Didn't care. The people that worked on this show either clearly gave a shit and knew their shit, or they knew they didn't want to piss us off. They were like, let's make something that the fans will like. And they went in the right direction for there. So, Godzilla the series, I think, is quite good, and it's a shame that it didn't last longer. That's really all there is to say. So, I really enjoyed that. So that wraps up this review. Phew, this one was a long one. Again, I said it was going to be a long one. I tackled a lot of material in it, but hopefully you all enjoyed it. And like I said, this is the second to last Kaiju Corner. Next month, right before the release of Godzilla King of the Monsters, well, it'll be about a month before the release, you'll be seeing my video centered on King Kong. Who better to end on than the other King of the Monsters, the original, the granddaddy of them all, King Kong. And there's a lot of different movies, probably more than you would probably think. And that one's going to be fun to tackle. So let's close out strong. King Kong's coming up next, but that is all I have for you now. So stay tuned next month where I'm really screwing up this outro. That is all I have for you now. Come back next month for King Kong. But until next time, later, everybody.